She was sold to a cold, paralyzed billionaire, a man no one dared approach. But as she stepped into his mansion, something in his icy gaze recognized her. Something terrifying, something forbidden. Secrets, betrayal, and a miracle that defies all odds are about to unfold. 3 lives, 1 empire, and a danger that will stop at nothing. Watch as love, power, and fate collide in a story you won't be able to turn away from until the very last heartbeat. I'm so glad you're here. Where are you listening to me from today? I pray for your happiness, your safety, and that every story here touches your heart deeply. Please stay with me till the very end of this journey, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an unforgettable story. Now, let's dive into today's tale. Pretty Bennett's wrists ached as rough hands pulled her across the threshold of the Blackthorn estate. The heavy oak doors groaned like the warning of a beast as they closed behind her, sealing her inside a mansion that reeked of power, leather, and the subtle but undeniable scent of danger. Every step echoed in the vast halls, bouncing off marble floors and gilded walls as though the house itself were watching her, judging her. The servants moved with silent precision, their eyes flitting toward her as if she were a fragile vessel about to shatter, and whispers trailed in her wake, some fearful, some pitying, some jealous, but Pretty's gaze remained steady, refusing to betray her fear. This was not the life she had imagined, yet something deep inside her stirred, a stubborn spark of resilience refusing to die under the weight of inevitability. At the center of the main hall sat Alessandro Blackthorn, a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow too dark to ignore. Paralyzed from the waist down, infertile by medical decree, and feared by the elite of every city he touched, he radiated a cold dominance that seemed almost supernatural. Even in his stillness, he owned the space, and Pretty felt it in her chest like a vice, like the room itself had shifted to accommodate his authority. His eyes, the color of midnight, scanned her from head to toe with unsettling precision. Each flicker of his gaze, each fraction of movement, suggested a mind that calculated, dissected, and understood far too much. There was no greeting, no polite inclination of his head, only the weight of silence and the sharp awareness of being fully seen, fully assessed. Pretty's heart hammered in her chest, yet she lifted her chin, refusing to appear smaller than she was. Her own dark eyes met his, and for a moment a strange flicker crossed his features, something close to recognition or perhaps surprise, but quickly buried beneath his icy mask. He made no move, said no word, yet his fingers twitched involuntarily, betraying a body that had long been trained in restraint. The air thickened around them, electric, suffocating, impossible to ignore. The tension pressed against her skin, curling along her spine like a live wire, and Pretty could not help but shiver despite the heat in her veins. She felt the eyes of every unseen servant, every shadow in the room, yet Alessandro's presence consumed her attention entirely, a gravitational pull she had no choice but to obey. The mansion itself seemed alive, the scent of leather-bound books, the faint trace of expensive cigar smoke lingering in the corners, the soft hum of distant machinery, even the faint creak of the chandelier above. They all conspired to create a world where Pretty felt simultaneously trapped and awed. The walls, lined with ancestral portraits of stern faces and distant relatives, seemed to lean toward her as if curious, as if warning. One painting, larger than the rest, caught her attention for a heartbeat too long. A man, much like Alessandro, seated in a chair with eyes dark and penetrating, stared out of the canvas with an uncanny intensity. Pretty's skin prickled, and she turned away quickly, aware that even the walls themselves held secrets that might swallow her whole. Alessandro's stillness was deceptive. Each subtle exhale, each slight twitch, each barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes suggested a predator observing prey, not in hunger, but in the careful measurement of control. When Pretty moved closer, Her shadow falling across his polished wheelchair, she felt his entire body respond despite its paralysis. A flicker of breath escaped him, a quiet hitch that was nearly swallowed by the cavernous room, yet for Pretty, it was a sound that echoed like thunder. She froze for a heartbeat, feeling as though she had accidentally trespassed into a sacred space she was never meant to enter. The room, once overwhelming with cold grandeur, felt suddenly intimate, almost dangerous, as though the air itself vibrated with unspoken words. She tried to focus on her breathing, tried to remind herself of the practicalities. She was sold into this life, yes, but her mind and her will were still her own. And yet, each careful step toward him, each subtle adjustment of her dress, each cautious glance, brought her closer to a truth she was not yet ready to name. Alessandro's gaze followed her like liquid ice, and for the first time she wondered if he recognized something about her, something deep, ancestral, or perhaps fated, that frightened even him. A tiny shiver traveled down her spine as her fingers brushed against a small marble table while she adjusted a vase of roses. He noticed. She could feel it in the almost imperceptible twitch of his long, elegant fingers, twitching as if desperate to reach out but restrained by a lifetime of limitation and pride. Pretty's pulse raced as she rounded the massive desk at the center of the room. The walls around her seemed to close in, subtly, the shadows pooling at the corners like living things. The servants' whispers had ceased entirely, leaving only the soft thrum of the grand mansion and the impossible pressure of Alessandro's gaze. She imagined him as a statue, frozen and untouchable, yet undeniably alive with suppressed energy. Each step she took toward the exit, toward even a semblance of freedom, felt weighted, as if invisible chains pulled at her ankles, at her heart, at the very soul she had fought to protect. She reached for the door, fingers trembling against the cold brass handle. Just as she was about to pull it open, a voice, low, hesitant, yet carrying an authority that resonated through her very bones, broke the silence. "Pretty," Alessandro whispered, his tone trembling slightly, betraying the centuries of control he had forced upon himself. The single word hung in the air like a lightning strike, and Pretty froze, hand halfway to the door, her heart hammering as though it might escape her chest. The sound of her own name, spoken by this untouchable, mysterious man in that fragile, almost vulnerable way, sent a shiver down her spine she could not ignore. Her fingers froze on the handle, her mind a swirl of fear, confusion, and a strange, irresistible curiosity. Was it recognition? Was it longing? Or was it something darker, something she could not yet comprehend, waiting for her to take the next step? The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, every shadow, every echo, every whisper pausing in anticipation. Pretty felt as though she had stepped into a world where nothing was simple, where every glance, every twitch, every breath carried significance she might only understand later. She swallowed hard, the tension tightening in her chest, and yet something deep inside whispered that her story had only just begun, and that the billionaire before her was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more alive than she had ever imagined. Even as she hesitated, the air seemed to pulse around them. Alessandro's eyes did not leave her, the faintest tremor stilling his perfectly controlled mask. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every step toward the door delayed by an invisible force. And then, just as she dared to inch back, thinking she might escape the suffocating pull of his presence, a subtle shift in his body, a barely perceptible lean forward, hinted at a reaction that was almost human, almost vulnerable. A small curl of panic and awe swept through her as the realization hit. This man, untouchable and feared, might be waiting for her, not as a wife, not as a prisoner, but as something far more intimate, far more destined. The first chapter closed with her hand hovering, Alessandro's whispered name hanging like a promise and a warning in the air, the mansion silent but alive around them, and the sense that nothing would ever be the same again. The threads of their fates had intertwined in that electric, terrifying instant. And the rest of Pretty Bennett's life and the empire that watched from the shadows would never forgive a misstep, nor forget the first touch of her presence against the untouchable billionaire too. The mansion's vast corridors seemed endless, their polished floors reflecting Pretty's hesitant steps like liquid glass. Each hallway stretched away into shadowed alcoves and hidden staircases, and the air was thick with quiet surveillance. Pretty quickly realized that the Blackthorn estate was no ordinary home. It was a gilded prison, every corner designed to watch, record and judge. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their eyes painted with such precision they appeared to follow her, calculating, silent witnesses to her arrival. Servants moved through the rooms like ghosts, silent and precise, their expressions unreadable. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with barely concealed fear, but all carried the unspoken knowledge that this house did not forgive mistakes. Pretty's pulse quickened with every step, a mix of fear and awe curling in her chest. Alessandro remained silent, an omnipresent shadow. Even in his paralysis, he rarely spoke, yet when he did, his words seemed to carve the air itself. His eyes, dark and fathomless, followed her with a quiet hunger he did not understand, a pull that made her skin tingle and her heart pound unevenly. Pretty noticed small things, the way his fingers flexed involuntarily when her shadow fell near him, the twitch of his jaw when she laughed softly, the almost imperceptible lean forward of his shoulders when she moved closer. Every movement, every reaction was like a map to a soul weighed down by years of sorrow, betrayal, and unspeakable secrets. It terrified her and drew her closer, all at once. Nights in the mansion were worse. The silence was not empty. It was listening, pressing against her eardrums, filled with Alessandro's quiet whispers. She often woke to hear him murmuring fragments of memories, heartbreaks, and a woman's name with such sorrow it ripped through her chest. The sound was a haunting melody, a song of grief and longing she could not name. Pretty lay frozen beneath her sheets, listening to his voice, feeling her own heartbeat in sync with the unspoken pain that seemed to pulse from him like a living thing. Something in her wanted to run, yet something far stronger, far more inexplicable, compelled her to stay, to hear more, to understand the ghost she glimpsed in his gaze. One afternoon, curiosity, or perhaps instinct, led Pretty down a corridor seldom traveled by servants. The air here was colder, the light dimmer, shadows thickening like silk. On one wall, she found a hidden door slightly ajar. Inside, dust hung heavy, and the scent of old oil paint was strong. There she discovered a portrait that stole her breath. A black woman, regal and striking, stared back at her with eyes that seemed to pierce through time. The resemblance was uncanny, the features almost mirror images of her own. Panic prickled her skin. Was it coincidence or something far older, far more deliberate? She stepped back, only to catch a glimpse of Alessandro's hands through the doorway leading to the hall. Even as he passed, avoiding the painting, his hands trembled slightly, a motion too human, too fragile for a man whose image of control was carved in stone. Pretty's heart skipped. What secret did this house hold, and why was she so intimately entwined with it? Days passed, each one stretching into the next, like a delicate, terrifying dance. Pretty observed the mansion and Alessandro with sharp eyes, noting the minutiae others might miss. The way his lips pressed together when she entered a room, the way his breath hitched ever so slightly when she brushed past him, the way he avoided direct questions about his past, yet revealed more in silence than words ever could. He was a puzzle, intricate and dangerous, with pieces she wasn't sure she wanted to assemble. And yet, each day drew her deeper, each small gesture binding her closer to a man who should have been untouchable. Fear mingled with fascination, curiosity tangled with desire, and Pretty realized she had stepped into a world far darker and far more intoxicating than she had ever known. At night, the mansion became almost sentient, shadows curling around corners like black smoke, whispering secrets in voices no one spoke aloud. Pretty lay in her bed, mind racing, heart hammering, as footsteps creaked faintly in the hallway. And then she heard it. A soft, deliberate sound of someone stopping outside her door. She froze, breath caught, every nerve screaming danger. Slowly, she turned her head and saw him. Alessandro, framed in the doorway, his eyes burning with something raw and unfiltered. There was hunger there, yes, but also desperation, a darkness that pressed into her soul as if he were both warning and pleading at once. Pretty's stomach twisted, and she felt the heat of fear and a strange pull of inexplicable curiosity tighten her chest. She could not look away, even though every instinct told her to flee. The following day, the mansion's secrets revealed themselves in subtle ways. Doors that should have been locked clicked open on their own. Shadows moved in ways that suggested more than coincidence. And Pretty caught fleeting glimpses of hidden servants exchanging glances, whispering urgently before vanishing down hallways. Every glance at Alessandro showed a man walking the razor's edge between vulnerability and control, a man whose past weighed on him like a storm he could not calm. Pretty felt herself drawn in with every step, every whisper, every twitch of his trembling fingers. The mansion itself seemed to conspire to bring them closer, each corner a stage, each shadow a player in a silent drama she could barely comprehend. She found herself standing in the same hallway as the mysterious portrait again, unable to resist its pull. Each time her gaze met the painted woman's, her chest tightened, her pulse quickened, and she shivered. Why did Alessandro avoid it? What history did it hold that even he could not face? As she stepped closer, she thought she heard a faint sigh behind her, a whisper almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind, yet unmistakably human. Her hand froze mid-air as the air shifted, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Something or someone was near her, heartbeat thundered in her ears. Alessandro's presence became more insistent, though he still said nothing aloud. He watched, always, with a hunger that did not yet have a name, and a restraint that bordered on agony. His silence was not emptiness. It was a fortress, a mask hiding a past soaked in grief, betrayal, and guilt. Every small tremor of his hand, every catch of breath when Pretty moved too close, was a confession of a man bound by secrets far older and heavier than she could yet imagine, and yet, the closer she came to understanding him, the more danger seemed to loom, not only from the outside world, but from the shadows lurking within the mansion itself. That night, when she finally turned to retreat to her chambers, Alessandro was there, waiting at the doorway like a phantom who had materialized from the very walls themselves. His eyes held a darkness she could feel pressing against her chest, but also a desperation that made her knees weaken. Pretty's pulse raced, every nerve in her body screaming that the mansion and the man within it were far more dangerous than she could have imagined. And then, before she could step away, his lips moved, not in a whisper, not in a shout, but in a sound that rattled her entire being. Pretty. It was the same tremulous, yearning tone from before, now deeper, more insistent, carrying centuries of unspoken longing and warning. She froze in the hall, caught between fear and fascination, unsure whether to flee or surrender to the magnetic pull of this mysterious, broken man. The air thickened around them, shadows shifting in response to the unspoken tension, and Pretty realized with a shiver that the mansion itself seemed to lean toward them, eager, watchful, and predatory. Every instinct screamed that danger and revelation were only a heartbeat away. The night closed in, leaving her trembling, aware and utterly captivated, as if the very walls of the Blackthorn estate were holding their breath for the moment when nothing would ever be the same again. 3. The air in the Blackthorn mansion seemed to pulse whenever Pretty entered Alessandro's presence, a quiet rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart and the subtle shifts of his paralyzed frame. Despite her resolve to maintain distance, to treat him as untouchable and untamable, she found herself drawn into the orbit of his silent gravity with every passing day. Each glance, each almost imperceptible twitch of his lips or narrowing of his eyes, tugged at her, weaving an invisible thread she could neither ignore nor sever. She caught herself adjusting his blankets with lingering hands, smoothing the fabric over his chest as if she were repairing not just a garment, but the fractures in his soul. He let her, and she realized in a terrifying moment that her closeness was allowed, welcomed even, though it was unspoken, unclaimed, and dangerous in ways neither of them dared to voice Alessandro's eyes. Deep pools of darkness flecked with sudden sparks of something almost human, softened whenever Pretty's fingers brushed his skin. It was a subtle thing, a twitch in his cheek, a flicker of warmth across eyes that had known only cold, calculated dominance for decades. Yet the mansion itself seemed to lean into those moments, shadows contracting toward them, walls bending inward with an almost conscious intent, as if the very house recognized the dangerous intimacy that crackled between them. Pretty felt her pulse quicken, heat pooling low in her stomach, as though some primal part of her had always been meant to feel this, to be near him in this way that defied reason, social order, and her own careful attempts at restraint. She read to him sometimes, her voice flowing like water, soothing the quiet emptiness of the mansion, while Alessandro listened with unnerving attentiveness. Each word, each inflection, seemed to touch some hidden part of him, and she caught him inhaling sharply whenever her hand lingered on his arm. For a second too long, sweat would bead on his brow during moments of tension or memory, and she found herself wiping it away, her fingers trembling slightly with a forbidden thrill she could not name. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken desires that neither dared acknowledge, each heartbeat echoing like a drum roll toward an inevitable collision. She knew this attraction, this pull, was dangerous, yet it drew her in as if the mansion itself were conspiring to erase boundaries, to collapse the fragile walls of propriety that she had constructed around her heart. A storm descended on the estate one night, the wind rattling windows and lightning splintering across the sky, illuminating the vast halls with sudden, blinding brilliance. Pretty was tending to him, adjusting his collar, smoothing the stiff fabric that had become a second skin against his cold, unyielding form, when her heart seized. Lightning flashed, revealing the hunger in Alessandro's gaze, raw and unguarded, and she felt the heat of it like a physical force pressing against her chest. She froze mid-motion, breath catching as electricity seemed to leap from the storm outside into the room, threading through her veins and settling low in her core. His paralyzed hand twitched with agonizing slowness, the movement deliberate, hesitant, but filled with impossible intent until his fingertips brushed her wrist. The sensation was electric, intimate, forbidden. Pretty's body stiffened, yet her pulse raced, drowning in the dangerous intimacy of the gesture. Her breath hitched, each inhale a reminder of how close she was to a boundary she could never cross openly. Alessandro's eyes widened fractionally, the darkness there softened by an unspoken vulnerability that mirrored her own terror and longing. Neither moved, neither breathed fully, each caught in a web of desire that terrified and enthralled them simultaneously. The storm's roar outside mirrored the storm inside her, the thunderclaps punctuating the tension that hummed like a living entity between them. Every muscle in her body screamed for retreat, yet another part of her thrilled at the impossible closeness, at the heat that made her blood run faster than the wind outside. Days passed, and the mansion seemed to shrink around them, each corridor, each shadowed alcove, a stage for their unspoken ballet of need and restraint. Alessandro's reactions grew more noticeable with every shared meal, every fleeting touch, every brush of hands when she passed by. He was meticulous, always controlled, yet there were tremors in his responses, micro-reveals of emotion that she pounced on, memorized and studied in secret. Pretty found herself lingering longer, her gaze tracing the angles of his face, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes held hers a moment too long before flicking away with practiced restraint. Every observation became a small confession of her obsession, her fascination with the man she was supposed to fear but could not resist. Evenings became the worst, the most intoxicating. She would catch him staring from across the room, a shadowed figure framed by candlelight, his eyes dark and searching, and she would feel a shiver of heat along her spine. It was as if he were reaching for her without moving, tethered to her by some invisible cord, and every heartbeat echoed the tension of his unspoken intent. Her own hands would tremble, not from fear, but from the pull of forbidden desire, a heat that grew stronger with every glance, every fleeting stolen brush of skin against skin. Alessandro's paralyzed hand twitched involuntarily at moments she lingered too long, a silent signal that the barrier between them, though rigid and formal, was crumbling under the weight of something neither could control. On one particularly stormy night, lightning split the sky, illuminating the massive study where Pretty had been adjusting his chair cushions. She bent forward, reaching instinctively to fix a fold in his collar, and felt the brush of his fingers against her wrist. Deliberate, agonizingly slow, and intimate in a way that made her gasp. Her heart pounded, threatening to escape her chest, and she froze, 1,000 thoughts racing through her mind. This was forbidden, dangerous. A crossing of lines neither of them had acknowledged, yet it felt inevitable, predestined and unavoidable. Her pulse raced in tandem with the booming thunder outside, a perfect mirror of the collision of their hearts, minds, and desires inside that room. Alessandro's gaze darkened. The storm reflected in his eyes, and his grip tightened around her wrist with a strength that belied his paralysis. The contact was shocking, overwhelming, a jolt of electricity she could feel through her entire body. Pretty froze, caught between fear and the intoxicating pull of proximity that made every rational thought vanish. Neither spoke. Neither moved beyond that trembling contact. Yet the world had shifted. She could feel it in the air, in the charged energy around them, in the mansion itself, which seemed to contract, shadows deepening, walls leaning in, as if holding its breath for the outcome of this forbidden collision. Mini cliffhangers threaded throughout the night. A servant's muffled gasp from the hallway, the wind rattling a distant window pane, a flicker of lightning revealing Alessandro's taut, trembling fingers. The echo of her own rapid heartbeat in the cavernous study, a faint creak behind a bookcase suggesting unseen eyes, and the mansion itself whispering warnings through shifting shadows. Each sound, each sensation heightened the tension, every element conspiring to make their forbidden connection unbearably real and impossibly dangerous. By the time the storm subsided, neither could speak. Neither could move, yet the electricity of the night lingered in their veins, in the small, lingering warmth of their shared space, in the brush of Alessandro's fingers against her wrist. Pretty's mind raced with what could never be named aloud, what must remain secret, yet the pull, the dangerous, forbidden pull, was a force neither could resist. The storm had passed, but the tempest within the room, within them, was only beginning, a slow-burning fire destined to ignite in ways neither dared predict. Rain pelted the windows of the Blackthorn mansion with relentless intensity, each drop like a small drumbeat echoing through the cavernous hallways, vibrating in Pretty's chest. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. The wild energy of wind and water pressing against the walls, rattling the panes, and carrying the faint scent of ozone and distant earth. Pretty sat beside Alessandro, close enough to feel the faint warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt, and yet aware that the heat between them was more than physical. It was something deeper, something unspoken that had been building in silence for weeks. The cold of the room, the chill of polished marble and leather, was no match for her presence. She could feel it, feel her own heartbeat warming the space, threading through him like sunlight, breaking into a frozen room. Alessandro sat with his back straight against the high-backed chair, his paralyzed frame taut, yet there was a looseness tonight, a fragile vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to witness. His eyes, normally shields of midnight ice, shimmered with a tension so raw it made Pretty's chest tighten. The room smelled faintly of cedar, leather, and the subtle metallic tang of his blood from old veins that had suffered poisonings he rarely discussed. He drew a shaky breath and began to speak, each word a careful release of decades of buried pain. "I was poisoned," he confessed, voice low, brittle, each syllable like a shard of glass in the air. Pretty's hand instinctively found his, brushing against the trembling fingers that had rarely known a touch of tenderness in decades. Her dark eyes softened, empathy rising from deep within her. She leaned closer, careful not to overstep the fragile boundary he had erected around himself, yet her presence alone seemed to coax a crack in his armor. "Alessandro," she murmured, her voice warm, gentle, an anchor in the storm. The words did not interrupt his confession, but seemed to give him permission to continue. He spoke of the betrayal that had shattered his ability to trust, of friends and family who had turned, of lovers who had lied and left, and of the infertility that had hollowed out the core of his pride and left a void he feared no one could fill. Every detail, every pause, every tremor in his voice revealed the weight he carried, a burden so immense it could have crushed any ordinary soul. Pretty listened intently, her fingers entwining with his, brushing against the long, elegant ones that twitched involuntarily, even in stillness. She could feel the tightness in his chest, the tremors that ran like hidden rivers through his body, and she realized that the man before her, feared, untouchable, untamed by the world, was quietly breaking under the weight of his own history. Her presence, gentle and steady, became a lifeline in a room filled with ghosts and regrets, and she could sense him leaning into her warmth, reluctant yet desperate for solace. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his breath catching as he admitted that he no longer remembered what warmth felt like, as though the concept itself had become alien to him. The storm outside intensified, lightning splitting the sky and illuminating the vast room in harsh, silvery flashes. The shadows danced along the walls, exaggerated and surreal, yet Alessandro's attention was fixed entirely on Pretty, as if the universe had shrunk down to the space between them. She brushed her forehead lightly against his, a delicate gesture meant to comfort, to steady, to offer a warmth he had never known. The contact was electric in its intimacy, charged not by lust but by something more profound, more dangerous, a bridge between two souls battered by the weight of isolation, fear, and unspoken desire. Every nerve in her body screamed, every instinct warned her, yet another part of her shivered in anticipation, craving the fragile connection she could feel solidifying in the tension around them. He inhaled sharply, a tremor running through his long, elegant fingers, and Pretty could feel it in her own hands, the electric echo of a man unaccustomed to touch but so desperately needing it. His eyes, dark and fathomless, searched hers as though seeking confirmation that what he felt, what he allowed himself to feel, was real, tangible, and reciprocated. The mansion seemed to close around them, the walls pressing inward, the echoes of rain and thunder outside fading beneath the intensity of the moment. Servants had long since retreated to safe distances, leaving the two of them in the quiet sanctuary of forbidden intimacy, the weight of his confession hanging in the air like mist. Pretty's heartbeat quickened. She could feel the storm outside, mirrored in the raw energy vibrating between them, the tension coiling and uncoiling like a living thing. Each brush of his trembling hand against hers sent shivers down her spine, a silent conversation they could not voice aloud. The air grew warmer, slower, thicker, a deliberate cocoon of intimacy that eclipsed the grandeur of the mansion itself. Alessandro's breath hitched, his normally rigid posture slackening just enough to reveal a fragility that could disarm any observer. Every flash of lightning illuminated his profile, sharp and impossibly handsome, yet marked with a humanity he had spent decades hiding from the world. A sudden roll of thunder shook the walls, a sharp, jarring sound that made Pretty flinch, and yet it drew them closer rather than apart. She leaned further into him, her warmth a silent promise, a reassurance that he had not felt in years. His lips parted slightly, and she noticed the way his breathing changed, uneven, shallow, trembling with an emotion he could neither name nor control. The fingers of his paralyzed hand twitched, brushing against hers, a silent plea, a desperate reach for something more than this carefully maintained distance. She held his gaze, feeling the pulse of vulnerability radiating from him, and understood that this night, this storm, and this quiet confession had broken down walls he had erected for decades, mini cliffhangers threaded through the night. A sudden knock echoing faintly from the distant library, a servant's hurried footsteps that vanished before reaching the room, a candle flickering in the drafts, casting long, unpredictable shadows across the floor, a faint whisper from the storm, as though the mansion itself were holding secrets meant only for them. Each small detail intensified the atmosphere, the tension between them tightening with every passing second. Pretty felt her pulse synchronize with his trembling form, each breath an unspoken dialogue, each glance a confession without words. Finally, Alessandro lifted his face toward hers, and the room seemed to shrink into nothing but their presence. His eyes held her captive, a mixture of vulnerability, desire and fear that made Pretty's chest ache. The storm outside roared, echoing the heat and uncertainty in the room, and he whispered, voice barely audible over the patter of rain, "Stay with me tonight, not as a wife, but as the woman who finally sees me." The words hung in the air, fragile and explosive, a turning point that could unravel decades of restraint, fear and secrecy. Pretty's hands tightened around his, her breath catching, heart hammering with a mixture of longing, terror and exhilaration. The moment was suspended, fragile yet eternal, and neither could move, speak or breathe as the mansion held its breath with them. The night stretched onward, shadows crawling across walls like living things, lightning illuminating Alessandro's profile in stark, unforgiving flashes. Every instinct screamed danger, yet every nerve and every heartbeat demanded connection. Pretty knew the night would change everything, that walls built over decades had begun to crumble, and that the mansion itself had become a silent witness to an intimacy that neither could yet define. Each small gesture, each tremor in his hands, each sigh and hitch in his breathing became a testament to the cracks in his armor, and the dangerous, thrilling, forbidden pull that was drawing them together, threatening to ignite in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 5. The mansion had grown quieter after Alessandro's confession, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Pretty lingered near him, her hands brushing against his whenever she could, each touch a delicate act of rebellion against the solitude he had surrounded himself with for decades. She brushed his hair back, smooth and careful, letting her fingers linger in the strands that had rarely known tenderness. She massaged his stiff, trembling fingers, coaxing the tight muscles to relax beneath her touch, whispering soft words of warmth that seemed to seep into the spaces inside him that had long been empty. Each gesture, each glance, each breath shared in silence was a small act of defiance against the cold world that had long claimed him. Alessandro watched her like a man starved for light after years in darkness. Every time her hand brushed his, he flinched with an intensity that was almost unbearable, and yet his gaze never left her. He seemed to drink in every detail, the curve of her neck, the way her dark eyes held a fierce compassion, the way her lips moved softly even when speaking in hushed tones. Every subtle movement she made stirred something in him he could not name, a warmth that had long been foreign, a desire that hovered at the edges of control, and yet he restrained himself, torn between the dangerous pull of need and the rigid boundaries he had built over a lifetime of pain and betrayal. Evenings were the worst and the most intoxicating. Pretty found herself wandering into the secret rose garden, a sanctuary hidden from prying eyes, where moonlight spilled across silver leaves and petals glistened like tiny jewels in the night. Alessandro followed, his hand brushing hers lightly, a tentative connection neither dared name, yet both felt deeply. The air was thick with the scent of roses and the faint lingering smell of his cologne, a heady mixture. That sent shivers down her spine. Each step brought them closer, the space between them charged with a tension that was almost tangible, as if the universe itself leaned in, holding its breath for the inevitable collision of two hearts that had long been starved for connection. The moonlight traced the contours of Pretty's face, illuminating the soft lines of her expression, the subtle curve of her lips, the way her eyes held a light he had not known in decades. Alessandro lifted his trembling hand, each motion deliberate and slow, and placed it lightly on her cheek. The touch was gentle yet overwhelmingly intimate, as if he were mapping the terrain of a soul he had spent his entire life longing to understand. Pretty froze, breath catching in her throat, heart hammering in a rhythm that matched the rapid pulse of his own. The moment stretched, suspended in time, as if the garden itself had ceased to exist outside the fragile space they occupied. He leaned forward, forehead pressing against hers, in a gesture that was at once tender and electrifying. His lips hovered just above hers, yet the connection was not physical. It was deeper, more profound. He whispered, voice trembling but sure, "You are the first person who has made me feel alive in years." The words struck her like lightning, igniting a fire in her chest that spread to her limbs, her mind, and her very soul. Pretty felt emotions she could neither define nor name, a chaotic blend of fear, desire, exhilaration, and longing. Their hearts collided in silence, an invisible fuse burning between them that promised passion, danger, and revelation. The roses around them swayed in the night breeze, petals brushing against her arms as though the garden itself had awakened to witness the intimacy forming beneath its branches. Alessandro's hand lingered, trembling slightly, his thumb brushing lightly against her jaw, tracing the delicate lines of her face as if memorizing them for a lifetime. Pretty's breath hitched, and she felt her knees weaken, caught between the intoxicating pull of proximity and the sharp edge of danger that always accompanied him. Every nerve, every heartbeat, every fiber of her being seemed attuned to him, a symphony of sensation that left her dizzy and breathless. Mini cliffhangers threaded throughout the night, a sudden rustle in the bushes, faint and deliberate, suggesting an unseen observer, a candle's flame flickering through the mansion windows, casting shadows across the garden in shapes that seemed alive, a distant dog barking, carrying the sound far into the dark, still night. Alessandro's hand twitching ever so slightly, betraying the effort of restraint as he fought the magnetic pull toward her lips. Pretty's pulse quickening in tandem, a silent acknowledgement that the world outside this moment no longer existed. Each detail heightened the tension, every sound and shadow a warning and a thrill, amplifying the dangerous intimacy that had quietly grown into something consuming. They remained locked in that private universe, the moonlight tracing their outlines, the roses encircling them in a fragrant protective ring. Alessandro's lips brushed against her hair, against the curve of her ear, subtle gestures that spoke volumes more than words could. Pretty's hands rested lightly against his chest, feeling the tremors in his body, the rapid heartbeat that echoed in her palms. Every brush, every sigh, every micro-motion was a conversation in silence, a dialogue of desire, trust, and the dangerous thrill of proximity that neither could name aloud, but both felt in every fiber of their being. The garden, the mansion, the night itself, seemed to conspire to hold them in this fragile, suspended moment. Every rustle, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind became a punctuation mark in the quiet story they were writing together. And then, in a moment of eerie stillness, Pretty sensed a presence, an almost imperceptible energy brushing against the edge of the garden. She froze, the sensation prickling her spine, a warning she could not yet place. Alessandro's hand tightened around hers instinctively, his dark gaze scanning the shadows, but neither of them spoke. Their focus, their entire world, remained fixed on the fragile electric connection between them. Then, barely perceptible, a pair of eyes glimmered in the darkness, hidden behind a thick curtain of foliage. Watching, waiting, malice coiled in those eyes, a quiet, calculated fury that went unnoticed by the two souls entangled in the moonlight. They remained unaware of the danger that had crept silently into their night, the silent plotting that would soon shatter the fragile cocoon of intimacy surrounding them. Pretty and Alessandro existed in their own universe, hearts and souls colliding, unspoken desires burning and dangerous, while the shadows around them stirred with intentions that would bring chaos to the sanctuary they had so carefully created. The night stretched on, tense, charged, intimate, and delicate. Alessandro's hand remained on her cheek, trembling but firm, his breath steadying slowly as he fought the internal storm of longing and restraint. Pretty's eyes reflected the moonlight, wide and luminous, a mirror to the fire she saw in him, a fire that threatened to consume them both if they did not find a way to navigate the treacherous pull of desire that had grown between them. Their hearts beat in tandem, an unspoken rhythm that could be felt in the space between fingers, in the press of foreheads, in the silent dialogue of glances and proximity. As the moon dipped lower, casting long silver shadows across the roses and the cobblestone path, the pair remained unaware of the fury and plotting that lurked in the darkness beyond the garden, an unseen presence intent on disrupting the fragile intimacy they had begun to cultivate. The night had set the stage, hearts had collided, and the mansion itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, knowing that what had begun under the silver glow of moonlight was only the beginning of a storm that would test, challenge, and transform the two souls irrevocably. The storm outside had quieted, leaving the Blackthorn estate shrouded in an eerie silence that pressed down with the weight of anticipation. A sudden crackle of electricity snapped the stillness, a shudder running through the ancient wiring of the mansion, and then everything plunged into darkness. The opulent halls, usually filled with the faint glow of lamps and chandeliers, were swallowed by shadows. Pretty's heart skipped as the silence was broken only by the soft, rhythmic drip of rain seeping through the eaves and the distant hum of generators kicking in and failing. Darkness settled like a living entity, heavy and pressing, curling around the corners, around furniture, around the two of them in a way that made every sound, every breath, every heartbeat feel magnified. Alessandro shivered, his breath catching sharply as a sudden spasm of pain twisted through his body. Pretty froze, her eyes searching the inky black, the familiar outlines of the room barely visible. The shadows were not just shadows tonight. They were alive, creeping across the walls as if aware of the vulnerability laid bare between them. Alessandro's fingers twitched, his jaw tightening, and then, almost imperceptibly, he sagged forward in a way that terrified her. She rushed to him instinctively, wrapping her arms around his torso, feeling his trembling frame shake as though the cold darkness had seeped into his very bones. Her hands found his face, steadying, pressing lightly against his temples as she whispered, "I'm here, Alessandro. I'm not going anywhere." Her voice cut through the silence, soft yet insistent, a lifeline tethered to the warmth of her presence. His chest rose and fell rapidly, shallow breaths betraying the sudden seizure-like pain that had overtaken him. Pretty's hands moved with careful precision, touching, pressing and tracing the lines of his face, a rhythm that somehow calmed the chaotic storm, both inside him and around them. The intimacy of it, the sheer vulnerability, was overwhelming. She could feel his heartbeat hammering against her palms, a frantic rhythm that seemed almost impossible for a man who had spent decades in rigid control. Alessandro clutched her hand, his grip shockingly strong, a silent confession of need that broke through the layers of ice he had encased himself in. "Pretty, you make me feel alive," he whispered, voice trembling, raw and unpolished, a sound that would have shattered anyone else. But Pretty held him closer, forehead pressed to his, allowing herself to sink into the fragile intensity of the moment. The room, the mansion, even the night outside ceased to exist except for the two of them, colliding in a nexus of emotion, fear, longing and trust. Every tremor in his body became a pulse in her own veins. Every hitch in his breath reverberated against her chest. The darkness became an accomplice, cocooning them in its protective shadows while amplifying the intensity of the moment. Pretty felt the weight of years, decades, centuries of isolation pressing into Alessandro's every movement, every whispered confession, every tightening grip, and yet, in her arms, he began to unravel, exposing parts of himself that had never seen light. His lips parted slightly, voice hoarse, as he murmured fragments of memory, painful betrayals, losses, regrets, moments of fleeting joy snatched away before they could fully exist. Pretty listened without interruption, hands cradling his face, thumbs stroking the arch of his brow, each gesture a silent promise that she would not abandon him. Mini cliffhangers threaded through the darkness, the faint creak of a floorboard somewhere in the hall, suggesting the presence of a distant servant or intruder, the sudden gust of wind that rattled a nearby window, making the room shudder. Alessandro's hand twitching violently as he fought through another wave of pain. Pretty's own breath catching, sensing a shift in his energy, a silent warning that his body might betray him further, the soft drip of water from the roof, echoing like a distant heartbeat in the silent mansion. Each sound, each tremor, heightened the tension, a constant reminder that danger and intimacy existed side by side. In the same breath, Alessandro's body shook against her, muscles tight with unspent tension, and Pretty felt the rawness of it in every line of his frame. Her hands moved from his face to his shoulders, tracing the stiffness and urging it to release, every motion tender, deliberate, almost ritualistic. He leaned heavily into her touch, as if drawing strength and comfort from the simple act of being held. She whispered reassurances, words that could not undo the pain, but that somehow eased it, layering warmth over the cold, rigid walls that had surrounded him for decades. Her closeness, her steady presence, became an unspoken lifeline, tethering him to something real, something human, something alive. In a sudden, unguarded moment, Alessandro's head tilted back slightly, lips brushing against her temple, breath mingling with hers in the confined darkness. Pretty's heart raced, every nerve flared to life with the forbidden intimacy of their closeness. She could feel him trembling not just from pain, but from the intensity of their shared vulnerability. Her own heartbeat accelerated, every pulse a silent dialogue with his own, communicating understanding, empathy, and an unspoken desire that hung in the air, electric and fragile. The room, though dark, seemed alive with the collision of two souls, raw and unpolished, navigating the boundary between comfort, need, and an intimacy neither had dared to admit until now. The storm outside returned in a low rumble, the thunder echoing in the mansion's vast halls, harmonizing with the tremor in Alessandro's body. Pretty held him closer, rocking him gently, as if she could absorb his pain through the warmth of her own body. His voice, though faint, whispered again, I can't. I've never felt anything like this." The words trailed off into a shuddering exhale, and Pretty pressed her forehead to his, letting the contact speak the language that words could not convey. Each heartbeat, each tremor, each subtle twitch became a testament to their shared vulnerability, the intimacy of two souls colliding under the weight of fear, pain, and desire. Time lost meaning as they remained entwined in the darkened room. Alessandro, clinging to Pretty with surprising strength, whispering fragmented confessions, his body trembling with waves of emotion and pain. She felt his tears, hot and sudden, against her shoulder, soaking through her nightgown, and in that moment, every layer of pretense, every shadow of fear, every fragment of control shattered between them. The mansion, silent witness to centuries of power and isolation, now held only their breaths, their whispered words, and the tremors of a night that would forever change the course of their lives. As dawn approached, pale light filtering through rain-streaked windows, Pretty stirred, stretching in the half-light, only to feel an unfamiliar flutter in her stomach. It was gentle, almost teasing, yet undeniable. A warmth that pulsed in a rhythm, foreign, yet familiar, a sign that something new had taken root inside her. Her hands instinctively cradled the subtle swell, the realization dawning slowly but irrevocably. Alessandro stirred beside her, still asleep, yet exuding a quiet vulnerability that lingered in the space between them. The mansion remained quiet, the storm outside spent but leaving an indelible mark on both of them, a testament to a night that had broken barriers, merged souls, and introduced a change. Neither had anticipated the distant hum of the generator flickering back to life, sending shadows skittering across the walls. A faint creak in the hallway, as if someone approached the door. Alessandro's fingers twitching in sleep, reaching instinctively for her. Pretty's own heartbeat quickening at the flutter in her stomach, a new unknown secret forming between them. The mansion itself seeming to hold its breath, waiting for the repercussions of the night to unfold. Each subtle sensation, each sound, each small tremor kept the tension alive, hinting at both wonder and danger yet to come. 7. The first rays of dawn crept across the Blackthorn estate, illuminating the grand hallways in a fragile golden light. But within the walls of the mansion, Pretty felt a shift in herself she couldn't yet explain. It started subtly at first, a flutter in her stomach, a wave of dizziness, a tenderness that had no precedent. Her senses seemed sharper, each sound and smell of the mansion amplified. The faint creak of the servants' shoes on polished floors, the scent of polished wood and leather mingled with the lingering musk of Alessandro's cologne, the faint rustle of curtains stirred by the morning breeze. Each detail prickled against her skin, a quiet, electric warning that something extraordinary had taken root. Alessandro stirred beside her, the dark circles beneath his eyes softened by the night of vulnerability they had shared. But there was still a trace of tension in his shoulders, a silent, lingering caution, as if he sensed the same tremor of change that Pretty did. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers lightly across her stomach, a gesture tender yet instinctively protective, his face unreadable, but his body betraying every ounce of awe, fear, and longing intertwined. Pretty's hand rested over his, warmth seeping from his skin into hers. And for a moment, the world outside seemed suspended, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The subtle nausea that had begun creeping over Pretty's senses intensified, wrapping around her stomach like a gentle, insistent tide. She pressed her palm over the flutter, her thoughts whirling. Could it truly be? Was the sensation merely a remnant of exhaustion from the night before, or was it a sign of life growing inside her? The mansion's silence, previously comforting, now pressed against her chest, making every footstep outside her door sound magnified, every whisper of the wind an urgent question. She felt both fear and exhilaration in equal measure, her mind oscillating between hope and doubt. Alessandro's gaze never left her. His dark eyes, heavy with sleep yet sharp with focus, seemed to penetrate deeper than ever before. The silence stretched between them until Alessandro spoke, voice low, a rough whisper almost swallowed by the walls. "Pretty. You feel different." It was not a question, not yet. Just an observation that carried the weight of the impossible, the weight of hope he had never dared to allow himself to carry. Pretty's throat tightened. She could only nod, her pulse hammering like a drum, echoing through the empty corridors. By mid-morning, word had quietly reached the private doctor Alessandro had called him, hands trembling as he requested absolute discretion, yet the urgency in his voice betrayed a storm beneath the composed exterior. The doctor arrived swiftly, tall and precise, carrying his instruments and a medical bag whose contents had never before felt so monumental. Pretty sat in the sunlit study, hands clasped over her stomach, nerves thrumming with anticipation. Alessandro hovered near her, a silent sentinel, eyes flicking nervously from her face to the door and back again, as though expecting danger or miracle to erupt at any moment. The examination was meticulous, long and heavy with tension. Pretty felt every touch of the doctor's hands, every cold instrument against her skin, each measurement and observation magnified by the quiet presence of Alessandro at her side. He whispered encouragements, brief and clipped, his fingers brushing hers in small, grounding gestures, his gaze never wavering from hers. The mansion seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment, the silence punctuated only by the soft beeping of medical equipment and the rain pattering against the windows in the distance. Finally, the doctor stepped back, hand trembling as he removed the stethoscope. His eyes widened, mouth opening slightly, then closing again in disbelief. "Pretty, you're pregnant," he whispered, voice shaking, barely containing the storm of his own surprise. Alessandro's breath caught, muscles taut, his eyes darting to Pretty as though seeking confirmation, fearing that the impossible had slipped into illusion. Pretty's chest tightened, her mind spun, and then the words came, breaking through the fog of uncertainty. "And it's not one." The doctor paused, hands shaking as he steadied himself. "But triplet boys." The revelation hit the mansion like a thunderclap. Alessandro's knees buckled, and Pretty rushed forward to steady him, her hands pressed against his chest as he clutched her face with an intensity that left them both breathless. Tears streamed down his face, unbidden and raw, each drop a testament to the years of longing, despair, and impossible hope that had accumulated inside him. "3," he whispered over and over, voice breaking, fingers tracing the curve of her jaw and the swell of her stomach. "3. Our sons. I never—" Words failed him entirely, replaced by shuddering breaths and trembling hands pressed against her, as if anchoring himself in the miracle before him. Servants and guards, who had witnessed Alessandro's transformation over the past days, murmured prayers, some dropping to their knees in the hallway outside the study, others weeping quietly at the impossible blessing unfolding before their eyes. Pretty felt a heady mixture of disbelief and awe, her chest swelling with a sense of purpose she had never known she had, in an instant, become the center of an empire she had only just begun to navigate, her very existence now a catalyst for hope, for continuity, for life that had been denied for far too long. Each glance from Alessandro, each tear and whispered prayer reinforced the enormity of what had just occurred. The infertile billionaire had fathered 3 heirs, and they were safe within her womb. Mini cliffhangers threaded through the unfolding morning, a sudden crack at the estate gates, like metal scraping stone, the soft whisper of the wind, carrying a hint of movement among the hedges outside, a shadow flitting across the grand hall windows, unnoticed but deliberate. Alessandro's trembling hand brushing hers, tightening instinctively as though he sensed unseen eyes watching. Pretty's own stomach fluttering, a subtle warning of the new life inside her that could change everything, yet also attract danger. Every detail heightened the tension, a constant reminder that miracles often come with shadows lurking nearby. The mansion seemed to hold its breath for hours, the quiet, reverent calm broken only by Alessandro's soft sobs, Pretty's whispered reassurances, and the occasional click of the doctor's equipment. They had survived disbelief and despair, but the storm outside the walls mirrored a storm within, each ripple and echo in the estate signaling that their lives were now irreversibly intertwined with the miracle growing inside her. And then, just as the estate began to settle into a fragile rhythm, a courier arrived at the front gates. He moved with urgency, breathless and careful, placing a thick, blood-stained envelope on the steps before disappearing into the shadows. The moment it touched the marble floor, a chill ran through the mansion, silencing the air. Alessandro's fingers trembled as he picked it up, recognizing the dark intent behind the heavy wax and the dripping red that stained the envelope. Pretty's heart skipped as she leaned closer, the flutter in her stomach suddenly mingling with a cold, unmistakable dread. The envelope contained a single message, written in jagged, deliberate strokes. "Those babies are worth more dead than alive." A silence heavier than the storm enveloped the mansion. Guards stiffened, servants gasped, and Pretty pressed her hands over her heart, feeling the life within her and the weight of the threat pressing in from all sides. The miracle of the triplets had been realized, but with it came a darkness that no amount of love, no amount of protection could fully shield them from. Alessandro's gaze darkened, his protective instincts flaring, and the mansion itself seemed to tense, awaiting the confrontation that would inevitably follow. The distant clang of a gate bell, as though someone was testing the perimeter. Footsteps echoing in the hallways, soft yet deliberate. The faint scuffle of leaves outside, a shadow slipping along the stone path. Pretty's hand instinctively gripping Alessandro's sleeve, feeling the subtle tremor of fear and determination in his muscles. The unborn triplets stirring within her, a tiny, undeniable pulse of life and promise that contrasted with the looming threat. The impossible had been achieved, but danger had already arrived, and the mansion held its breath, ready for the battle to come. The Blackthorn estate, once a realm of cold corridors and shadowed halls, now seemed to pulse with life, a rhythm dictated by Pretty's presence. Every room she passed, every servant who bowed to her, every guard who straightened under her gaze acknowledged a new power rising, not of fear, but of respect. Pretty had become the beating heart of the empire, her strength a beacon in the shadow of Alessandro's towering dominance. Her hands moved with authority over the estate, arranging schedules, inspecting kitchens, overseeing preparations for the arrival of their triplets, all while maintaining the warmth and compassion that had always been her shield and her weapon. Alessandro never left her side, a constant sentinel who had never imagined such devotion could exist in his life. His worship was quiet but absolute. Kissing her hands as she passed, brushing her hair from her forehead in reverence, pressing gentle, lingering kisses to her growing belly while whispering soft promises no one else would ever hear. "You are everything I never knew I needed," he murmured one evening, breath warm against her ear, hand resting protectively on her womb. Pretty's heart fluttered at his devotion, at the intensity in his gaze that mirrored a soul once broken, now made whole by her presence. Their love had become a quiet, unstoppable force, bending the mansion to its rhythm, drawing awe from those who served them and envy from those who coveted them. Rivals of the Blackthorn Empire whispered behind closed doors, their voices laced with disbelief and fear. The young Black Queen had tamed the untouchable billionaire, and in doing so, she had become untouchable herself. She moved with an effortless combination of poise and authority, her dark eyes cutting through lies, her soft words carrying an undeniable weight. Each action she took rippled through the estate, a demonstration that power and gentleness could coexist, that loyalty could be commanded without cruelty. But with every step she took toward control, the shadows of those who envied and plotted grew longer, curling around corners, seeping through cracks in the walls, and threading into the quietest rooms. Late one night, the mansion was unusually still. Alessandro slept in the grand bed beside her, fingers entwined with hers, breathing slow and steady. Yet his presence was a protective anchor that allowed her to sense every stir of movement in the halls. Pretty's hand rested lightly on her belly, feeling the rhythmic thrum of life that had grown inside her since the miracle revelation. But as her fingers traced the soft curves, a sudden, sharp jolt startled her, a kick far stronger than the others. Her breath caught. Then another stir, weaker, hesitant, almost imperceptible. Her pulse quickened, a wave of instinctive fear washing over the elation that had filled her days. Something was wrong, and her maternal intuition screamed it before her mind could even process. The stillness of the mansion pressed against her chest as she called the private doctor, voice calm yet urgent, masking the panic rising in her chest. Minutes stretched like hours, the shadows outside her window twisting with the flickering light of the storm gathering beyond the estate's gates. When the doctor arrived, his usual composure was cracked, a sharp pallor spreading across his face as he adjusted the equipment and prepared for the scan. Alessandro hovered near the door, watching every movement, his face a mask of tension and devotion, hands trembling slightly, as if the mere act of standing near her could give him strength to protect her and the lives inside her. Pretty lay on the examination bed, stomach exposed, hands resting lightly atop the swell of her belly. She tried to calm herself with measured breaths, but the fluttering, uneven movements of the triplets beneath her palm made her chest tighten. Alessandro's hand brushed hers, fingers entwined in a silent vow that he would not let harm touch them, that he would shield both her and their sons with every ounce of power he commanded. The doctor's face, pale and tight with tension, betrayed a reality Pretty had not wanted to imagine. Each passing moment stretched the thin line between hope and fear, the mansion itself seeming to hold its breath, waiting for the revelation that could redefine their lives. The scan began, the machine humming softly, each tone amplified in the silence of the room. Pretty's eyes darted between Alessandro's anxious expression and the doctor's furrowed brow, a silent dialogue passing between them. Time seemed to fracture, minutes becoming eternities, each heartbeat of hers echoing through the walls, each kick of the baby's a silent message, each breath from Alessandro a tether anchoring her to strength and comfort. And then the machine displayed what made even the doctor's trained hands tremble. "Pretty," the doctor whispered, voice almost breaking, eyes wide as he adjusted the screen. "There's a complication with one of the babies." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Alessandro's hand tightened around hers, white-knuckled, fingers pressing into her skin as he leaned forward, eyes wide with disbelief and protective rage. Pretty felt her chest constrict, a mix of fear, love, and determination surging through her. She pressed her free hand over her heart, feeling the tiny flutters, the reminders of the life she carried, and instinctively knew that she could not allow anything to harm them. The mansion seemed to vibrate with tension, every shadow sharper, every creak in the hall more ominous. The triplets' miracle now hung on a fragile, perilous thread, and the walls themselves seemed to whisper of dangers lurking both outside and within the estate. Many cliffhangers threaded through the night, a shadow moving across the hallway outside, too deliberate to be the wind. The faint rustle of a curtain in the drawing room catching Alessandro's narrowed attention, the humming of the monitor suddenly glitching, a faint alarm almost imperceptible. Pretty's own pulse hammering in her ears as another uneven kick shakes her belly, a warning she cannot ignore. The storm outside beginning to rise again, wind rattling windows and carrying the sense of foreboding that mirrored the complication revealed on the screen. Each subtle sound, each flinch, each breath made the room feel alive with suspense, the quiet tension threatening to erupt at any second. Alessandro's eyes, dark and fierce, met hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "I will not let anything happen to them, Pretty," he said, voice low, determined, unyielding. Every inch of him radiated protective energy, a promise etched into the very air of the room. Pretty, trembling yet resolute, felt the weight of her own power, her own resilience, intertwining with his. Together, they formed a wall against the threat looming over the triplets. The mansion, silent witness to centuries of control and isolation, now bore witness to the rise of a queen who would fight for her sons, her love, and the empire they would inherit. Outside, unseen eyes lingered at the edges of the estate, whispers and intentions folded into shadows, waiting for a misstep, a moment of vulnerability. Inside, Pretty felt every heartbeat, every tremor, every flutter of life against her hands, each one a promise of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. The night stretched on, heavy with anticipation, power and fear, as if the mansion itself was bracing for the storm, both within and beyond its walls. Pretty and Alessandro, bound by love, devotion, and the miracle growing inside her, stood together at the precipice of destiny, unaware that the complications were only the beginning, that the arrival of their sons would awaken forces far more dangerous than any of them had yet faced. The storm outside had grown into a tempest, rain hammering against the tall windows of the Blackthorn estate, lightning illuminating the mansion's opulent halls in jagged, blinding flashes. Inside, Pretty Bennett's breathing came in uneven, sharp gasps, her body trembling with contractions that hit in waves, relentless and consuming. Alessandro was at her side, every fiber of his being tense, a rock of devotion and anxiety intertwined. His hands, always steady in her presence, now shook ever so slightly as he held hers, fingers gripping hers with a desperation that mirrored the storm outside. The grandeur of the estate, once a symbol of power and control, now seemed fragile, its halls echoing with the quiet chaos of imminent life and danger. Servants and guards moved in precise, rehearsed motions, yet their whispers of awe and fear underscored the gravity of the moment. Alessandro's orders rang out, sharp and unwavering. "No one leaves, protect her at all costs. She is my life, and my sons' lives are mine to guard." The words were met with nods, hurried movements, and the tense awareness that they were participants in something historic, something that would be told in hushed tones long after the storm had passed. Alessandro's gaze never left Pretty, his dark eyes reflecting terror, hope, and an aching love that seemed to pulse in tandem with her contractions. Pretty cried out, her fingers digging into Alessandro's palms as another wave of pain struck. Yet even amidst the agony, she felt his presence as an anchor, a grounding force that made the impossible feel possible. He whispered her name over and over, words trembling, soaked with devotion, each syllable a promise. "I'm here. Always. Breathe, Pretty. You're my world. You're my queen." She felt the warmth of his lips against her forehead, his cheek pressed to hers as he murmured love into her ear. Each word a shield against the fear, each touch a lifeline through the storm of pain and anticipation. Hours passed like eternities. The mansion was alive with a quiet energy, every corridor, every room holding its breath in reverence and tension. The private doctor and nurses moved with urgent precision, monitoring her condition, the baby's heartbeats, the fragile dance of life and survival. Alessandro's hand never left hers, his knuckles white from gripping her fingers, his other hand brushing away sweat and damp strands of hair from her face, murmuring encouragements that teetered on prayers. Every contraction seemed to ripple through the entire estate, a tremor of life and love so potent it felt as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting and blessing this moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity suspended in agony, the first cry split the air. A baby boy, tiny and perfect, let out a voice that carried more promise than any word could. Pretty's tears fell freely, her exhaustion mingled with overwhelming relief and uncontainable love. Alessandro's face crumpled entirely. He buried his head against her shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably, a man undone by joy, by fear, released, by the miracle he had longed for and never dared dream. The second cry followed moments later, another son, wailing into the world with vigor and vitality, and then the third, completing the triad of life they had created together. Each sound was a chord struck deep in Alessandro's soul, resonating with a love he had never known could exist in such magnitude. Pretty, weak but radiant with the glow of life-giving, held her three sons against her chest. She felt their tiny hearts beating, the warmth of their skin, their soft, trembling hands clutching at hers. The world, in that moment, contracted to the circle of her family, the storm outside becoming a distant roar, irrelevant to the immensity of what had just occurred. Guards whispered prayers, servants wept, and even the storm seemed to bow to the miracle within the estate's walls. Alessandro's sobs became whispers of devotion, each kiss to her forehead, each murmur to their sons a pledge of unyielding love. "You are my world, my life, my sons, my Pretty." Yet amid the overwhelming joy, a subtle tension lingered, unnoticed by none yet unspoken. The estate's shadows seemed longer than usual, corners darker and doors slightly ajar despite the vigilance of guards. Pretty, holding her sons, sensed a disturbance, a tiny flicker of unease that brushed against the edges of her consciousness. Her hand instinctively moved to her sons, cradling them closer. Instincts honed from weeks of protective anxiety during pregnancy, now instinctively alerting her to unseen threats. Alessandro noticed it too, his eyes narrowing, scanning every shadow, every movement, the protective fire in his gaze roaring silently yet fiercely. The mansion, though now filled with warmth and life, had become a battlefield of sorts, joy and danger intertwined, the miracle of the triplets balanced precariously against forces unseen. Then, just as the calm after the storm seemed to settle, a subtle movement caught Pretty's eye. The nursery door, previously locked and guarded, had a shadow slipping beneath it. Deliberate and slow, Alessandro stiffened, sensing the same anomaly, his hands immediately tightening around hers and the baby's. With trembling fingers, he picked up the small envelope left on the floor, sealed with a dark intention that spoke of danger and vengeance. Pretty's heart skipped, a cold rush of fear mingling with the residual adrenaline of labor. She lifted her weary eyes to Alessandro, seeing every ounce of his devotion, every trace of protective fury mirrored in his face. The note, dark and deliberate, carried a message that chilled them to their core. Written in jagged, unforgiving strokes were words that would haunt the Blackthorn legacy. "The past is coming for your sons, and this time, it won't miss." Silence fell heavy across the mansion. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had just been delivered. Along with the note, guards tightened formations. Servants glanced nervously at each other, and Pretty held her sons close, feeling every heartbeat, every flutter, as though drawing strength from the very life she had carried through pain and miracle. Alessandro pressed his forehead to hers, whispering a vow that trembled with emotion and unbreakable resolve. They are ours, pretty. No one will touch them while I draw breath. A shadow flitted past the nursery window. A sudden creak echoed in the hallway outside. The wind slammed the gates with a sharp, jarring noise. Footsteps approaching silently in the outer corridors, and the faint brush of fabric along the floor signaled the presence of someone unseen. Each sound drew Alessandro's protective gaze outward, each flutter of Pretty's suns beneath her hands a reminder of what was at stake. Each tear and tremor binding them closer together against the world that would dare threaten their miracle. And in that tense, luminous moment, the mansion itself seemed to acknowledge the rise of a family forged in love, trial, and devotion. A family unshakable, unstoppable, yet now fully aware that joy and danger had intertwined, and that the path ahead, though victorious in life, was shadowed by forces lurking beyond the walls, waiting for the slightest opportunity. Pretty's eyes met Alessandro's, both exhausted, both resolute, both bound in a love that had transcended pain, loss, and fear. And though the night outside raged and shadows whispered threats, inside, in that nursery of miracles, their hearts and souls had become immortal, even as the first note of danger announced that the story and the fight for their sons was far from over. And that's where we'll leave our story. For now, I hope Pretty and Alessandro's journey, their love, their struggles, and the miracles they fought for, touched your heart as deeply as it touched mine. Remember, every story here is for you to feel, to dream, and to escape into. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Beyond Color Stories so you'll never miss the next adventure. Until next time, stay safe, stay inspired, and keep your heart open, because every story has a life of its own.